Hey friends, and welcome back to Sewing from Scratch. I am Kate, and this is where I teach you everything I know about sewing and we learn more together along the way. Today, I'm teaching you how to be a lazy sewist. Stick around to see what I'm talking about. Okay, so what do I mean by being a lazy sewist? Obviously, there's ways you can cut corners when you're sewing. Some of them work out great for you, others not so much. I am a firm believer in the fact that you need to learn the rules before you can break them. I'm a firm believer in that in everything, driving, sports, and especially in creative ventures. There's very few hard and fast things that you need to follow. So in this video, I wanted to share 5 ways that you can cut corners after you've learned the right way to do them. And that's simply because you need to know the mechanics of it. You need to know the reason why you do it this way so that you get this outcome. If you skip this step, you're gonna get this outcome instead. That's why I believe that you need to know how to do it right before you can skip corners but still get a similar good outcome. So in no particular order, let's start with number 1. First thing is backstitching. Yeah, you can skip backstitching sometimes. So what I mean by this is when you're sewing, say like a hem or somewhere where the end of your stitch is overlapping the start of your stitch, you don't have to backstitch at the start. You really don't even have to backstitch at the end because you can overlap those and then they act like locking back stitches in themselves. Do I always do this? No, but I often won't backstitch at the start. I'll sew around, come back, and then go sew forward, and then I'll backstitch a little bit or like just once. But I do that. If it's something like a really light fabric or it's where I don't want the seam to be noticeable at all, you know, top stitching or something like that, I won't backstitch. I will just go over it once. And that will lock in those stitches. If we look back at vintage work, vintage sewing machines, they didn't have a backstitch. So they would either turn the fabric around and stitch it the other way, or yeah, go back over top of it. It's similar to how ready-to-wear does like cover stitch. They won't backstitch, they'll just go right over top. It can unravel, but it's not as likely as you might think. You just need to make sure that your stitches are in fact right on top of each other. All right, rule number 2 for garment sewing, shortcuts. You do not have to finish your seams the way that the instructions say to. So oftentimes it'll be sew this seam and then finish it. If you're working with knits, you don't have to do that. You can just serge it. Just serge it at the same seam allowance, you're good. You don't need to sew on your sewing machine first and then serge, especially if you're using like a woolly nylon thread in your loopers or something. You just want to make sure that that seam will be able to stretch without popping. Sergers are often good for this. On wovens, a good shortcut is to actually serge all the edges of all the pieces first. And I know that sounds like a lot more work, but it actually saves time in the long run because it's kind of like batch sewing. You do all the same thing at once, and then when it's time to sew, you can just go ahead and sew. You don't have to be back and forth between the 2 machines. Another thing is to learn when you're going to finish your seams together and when you're going to finish them separate. If a seam will be finished together for sure, I wouldn't recommend serging it first because then obviously it'll get too bulky going through your machine. But if you plan to press all the seams open, then yes, go ahead and finish all those edges first on your serger because you're going to need to do that to have them open anyway. The times when you want them together is maybe like at a shoulder seam. Honestly, there's not a lot of times where it's like super important. Maybe a collar. A lot of times you are going to be opening those seams up so that they lay flat. Like in this shirt here, I have opened up all of these seams so that they lay flat and I top stitch them down. It just makes a nice smooth finish, not having so much bulk. Rule 3 is skipping notches and markings. Now, I've preached about this a lot, about how important they are, and they are super, super important. But there are times when they're not that important. Like for a hem, or like lining up certain color blocking. The only time it's like super important is if you have to ease something in. So if it's like curved, you need to know where those pieces line up so then you can ease the rest of it in. Collars are important, waistbands, all those kinds of things. But there are certain notches and markings that really aren't that important. You can get away with skipping them once you know what you can skip and the importance of them and how to get around it. Pocket placement is another one that you can skip because a lot of times you just put it where it works for your body. I'm thinking back pockets in this situation. Rule number 4 is interfacing. So patterns say to interface. You're gonna follow the pattern, you're always gonna interface, right? Wrong. You're not going to interface if it's like a super heavy fabric and you don't need that interfacing in there. Certain things, yes, you absolutely need to interface, like the button placket of a shirt if you're adding in buttons. Things like that are to add stability and function, but there's times where you don't need to add interfacing. If you're making, say, a bucket hat, they're really popular right now, so let's use that as an example. If you're using a heavier weight fabric like a denim or a canvas, and you don't want like a super exact brim, then you probably don't need to interface it. It's gonna depend on your fabric, and it's also gonna depend on the look that you're going for. As you work with fabrics and as you work with interfacing and learn kind of how they work together, you will know which ones you can skip the interfacing on and which ones you can't. Waistbands are another place you can skip interfacing sometimes. Something you could do instead is add some twill tape into the seam. There's a lot of ways that you can get around using interfacing, or sometimes you might want to use an extra strip of cotton woven or linen or something like that in place of interfacing. And rule number 5 that I think can be broken is stay stitching and basting. Now, you need to listen to the rest of this. Don't shut the video off yet. You can only skip these when you know the rules. So let's talk about stay stitching first. A stay stitch is just one line of stitching on one layer of fabric at your regular stitch length, probably about 2.5, just to keep things the way they are. We do this on necklines, especially anything cut on the bias, armholes, anywhere where you're going to be, where that seam might be getting stretched out. Now, the reason we do this and the reason we do it immediately after we cut that fabric is because that fabric can grow or stretch out and we want to stay the cut. So things like rayon or linen is really bad for it too. You want to keep that cut exactly where it is. So you're going to take it to your machine and you're going to stay stitch it. So why am I saying that you can skip stay stitching? Well, if you're using a fabric like a cotton woven or a denim or a canvas or even some polyesters, they don't grow. They're not going to stretch out. If you're not handling a lot, if you're doing your seam right then, you don't have to do it. There's times that you can skip stay stitching. Similarly, basting. So basting is when we crank our stitch length all the way as high as it will go, usually about 4 or 5, and we use that to put typically 2 pieces of fabric together. It's just holding those pieces together until we do our actual stitch. Lots of times you do this with pockets or something that you're just checking the fit of, that kind of thing. But sometimes you can skip that step. If you're going right to your sewing machine and stitching it together, if you're confident you can keep all those pieces lined up, again, this is going to depend on fabric. If you're using something really slippery that likes to move around a lot, definitely use your base stitches. If you're using something, again, like cotton woven or linens, something that doesn't really shift around too much, you can skip the basting step. Again, you need to know the rules, you need to know the fabric, and you need to know your own personal comfort level and skill level. And as you progress in your sewing journey, you will get more comfortable with skipping some steps, or know that you have to and you prefer to baste it like that. I still do, like, I don't even know, like 3 or 4 steps when I'm doing a gathering. I do 2 or 3 basting stitches. Sometimes I will even do a stay stitch around my gathering. This doesn't work super great, so I only do it occasionally, but then I'll baste it or stitch it, regular stitch, onto the garment that it's being gathered to, and then finally I will serge it. There's a lot of instances where I actually do more steps, but there's also some times where I skip steps. So I just wanted to share that with you and let you know that there are ways to be a lazy sewist, and I want to hear down in the comments below, how do you skip steps? What steps do you skip? And what's your favorite rule to break? Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up if it was good for you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so I can see you in the next video. Bye!